Hello and welcome. My name is Karen. I'm from Trapology, Boston, and we are an escape room and an immersive entertainment company based in downtown Boston. Today, we are joined by Kellian of Green Door Labs. Hello.
Hi.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then also maybe a fun fact that people can't find with just a quick Google search.
Oh, okay. So my name is Kellian. I am the mastermind for Green Door Labs, and I'm a game designer and producer. I've been building interactive, sort of experiential content for maybe, gosh, like 10 years now. And my specialty is sort of this digital physical hybrid. I do a lot of stuff with museums. And so I used to be an educator, and then I kind of became sort of a default museum educator, game designer. And a lot of the projects that I build either are in museums or they're connected to museum content. And even when I do something that is completely unrelated to museums, I can't help it. Like I have to dig around for the museum content. It's a really addictive habit, hanging out with museum people. So we, are building all sorts of like interactive, physical, digital experiences for people.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Was there some sort of light bulb moment where you were like, this is my passion, this is what I want to do forever, I'm so excited to do this?
Oh gosh. It's so hard to find those things. No, I don't feel like there was ever really like a solid moment like that. I lived in Shanghai for a really long time, about 5 years. And when I was there, I was teaching English. And then I got scooped up by this game design company over there. And it was a game design company where they taught English speakers how to speak Chinese. And I've always been really into foreign languages. So I thought that was really cool. And making a game that taught the foreign languages, I thought that was awesome. And so I was, I guess I was producer for that company over there. Totally unqualified, but they were, it was a totally new idea. It was a startup. So they're like, oh, here, you can do it. And then I came back to the United States and got my degree in education and was ready to go into like a regular old classroom. But I just had already been bitten by the game design bug and was like, oh, maybe not. And so, so instead I applied for another game design company. This one was called Scavenger. I was really lucky. This was a location-based gaming company, and they needed somebody who was willing to work with museums. And I love museums. I always have. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like I know a thing or two about education. This gives me an excuse to go to museums. And so, I just sort of connected with museums across the country and across the world. We had games in London and in France. And and we were sort of building these location-based digital scavenger hunts inside museums. But after a while, we kind of figured out that that was not necessarily like the best business. Like it's a fun business, but like nobody goes into working with museums or game design so that they can be millionaires. And this was a startup. So they pivoted and they became Level Up, which was another company. They do payment processing. They're part of Grubhub now. And so like, that's like a, big startup-y company. And in the meantime, I was like, oh, I really liked building games for and with museums. That was sort of my jam. So I started Green Door Labs instead. And so my first project right out of the gate was Murder at the Met with Metropolitan Museum of Art. I had already kind of been working with them for a project with Scavenger, but then Scavenger was like, no, we don't really want to be doing any of these gamey things anymore. We're just going to focus on Level Up. So I established Green Door Labs and went to the Met and was like, want to build a game? Like we can't do it with Scavenger, but we can still do it. And they were like, yeah, let's do it. So that was my first game, was Murder at the Met. And then it's funny, like maybe 2 months later, I did another game called Agents of Change with the Smithsonian. Neither of them were necessarily like, it's one of those things where it's like, you look back at work that you did 10 years ago and you're like, oh God, why did I do that? Right. So definitely not like my best work. But when you work with these museums, they have amazing art departments. And so they were able to pull things together. So they looked really beautiful. And since then I've been building games just with dozens of museums across the country. I just finished one up with the Old North Church.
Ooh.
And you can play it. Well, now it's online. And so that used to be a physical game, but we just fixed it up so that it's on their website. And and then same thing, the USS Constitution Museum was going to be a physical game. Now it's a digital game. So you can check that out as well.
Awesome. Cool. I mean, I know there's so much in museums. So I would love to hear a little bit about, is there an unexpected place that you got some inspiration, or something that people would be like, wait, you saw what and got what?
Oh my God, like every place, right? Like every museum has secrets, and they're such, like they are the original magical locations. So I can tell you so many. Okay, so the first one that comes to mind, I don't know if you ever saw, this was a couple years ago, and I almost feel a little bit guilty to say this because this museum isn't around anymore.
Um,
Did you ever go to the Higgins Armory out in Worcester?
I think I've been there once.
Yeah, it was like a magic castle full of armor, and it was amazing. And it's like when you're working with these guys, you go at off hours, and so you're there at night and like all the lights are off and you're like walking through all of it. I mean, how can you not be building stories and games and mysteries and puzzles like in these places? You're surrounded by all of these old knights in armor and everything. So that was one of my favorite places. Oh, that place, Higgins Armory also had this wonderful exhibit. They called it Beyond Belief. And they commissioned who's now my favorite artist. His name is Hilary Scott, and he built all these wild monsters and just sort of these untold stories. You can look it up. So it's online, but he created this wonderful character, Professor Rufus Excalibur Bell. And he said that he used to be the curator of curiosities for the Higgins Armory, but he disappeared in 1934, and now all we get is his packages from him. We haven't seen him since then. And so he has like all these boxes, like all these packages, and they're all like yellow and they're like tied up with string. And he's got like, penguins in scuba gear and like Yeti hands in capsules and, fairies in lock boxes and, just all these wonderful, wonderful creatures, in this scientist's office. And in fact, we actually ended up using that for a production we did called Save the Munbacks, where we created the American Society for the Protection of Magical Creatures. And we were all working together to try and save the northern crested Dimmoth Munbacks, which I'm sure you've heard of before.
Well, of course. Who hasn't heard of that?
Well, it's all thanks to Henrietta Hemingway and Nita Hall. And if it hadn't been for them saving the ecology of the northern crested Dimmoth Munbacks, it very well could have gone extinct. So good thing that didn't happen. That was back in the 1890s. And that was like one of those situations where like I used the Eustis Estate, which was this gorgeous museum, like if you have a chance to go, you should absolutely go. But if you don't, you can go online and they sort of have pretty good 3D images of everything that's there. It's out in Milton, Massachusetts. And it's just like this magical place. And so we dressed everybody up like wizards and we pumped in wizarding music. We had all these great stories and we were like, and this is now the ASPMC, the archives for magical creatures. And we got all of Hilary's stuff that I'd seen in the Higgins Museum and we moved it into this mansion. And so like you're walking through this mansion and there was like a Mongolian death worm. It's like 7 feet tall, and like gigantic robotic spiders and just all sorts of wonderful stuff.
I would say that sounds so wonderful and maybe slightly terrifying at times.
Oh, it was great. It was so great. Yeah. And this was at night too. And so we're in this mansion at night surrounded by like all of these magical creature sculptures that Hilary had created. And it's mostly sort of like low dim lighting. I had a friend who was an antiques dealer. And so like it's already a museum, and we moved like a whole truckload of period antiques and lighting in there. And so it was just all sort of lit up by candlelight. We hung all of these floating candles from the ceiling. So it looked like the cafeteria in Hogwarts. It was awesome.
That's so awesome. I love how, you saw something that you're like, this is really cool, and you kind of built a world around it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, well, that's what we do, right? I mean, that's what we all do as game designers. Like, you see a thing, and it's just like this constant association, like, oh, that belongs there, and in this world, and there, and the world just grows, as you see more things, and being connected to museums, it's like you see all these magical things all the time, right? So you're like, oh, well, that stopwatch, that totally would have been in this world, and that top hat, oh, I've seen that before, your mind just builds stories around things,
Yeah, definitely. Have you ever gotten a request where you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? And it kind of made everyone think a little bit differently about what you're doing now to kind of incorporate that object into something larger?
Oh gosh. I did have one request. Actually, this only happened once. That I got a request from, what was the name of it? The Cody something. It was a gun museum.
Ooh.
Out west. Yeah, and they wanted me to make a game. And so when I work with all these different museums, I'm always like, okay, so what are your goals? What do you want? Right? Like, what do you want this game to accomplish? And these guys were like, well, we want something that will make guns fun. And I was like, and that really hit me. I was like, there's certain things that I don't want to make fun, right? It's like, that's a weapon of war and death. It's for killing people. Like, I don't want to make that fun. And so, and if you want to make guns fun through games, like there's a lot of games out there that use a lot of guns. I mean, like, seriously, like watch Westworld, like there's a lot of guns happening. You don't need me for that. Yeah. So I think that's one request that I got, that I was sort of like, oh, I kind of do have a specialty. Like, you don't need me to make a shoot 'em up. There's a million guys that will make a shoot 'em up for you and will be thrilled about it. Like, there's no need to hire me for that.
Was
So,
there
yeah.
ever a request that like initially was like, wait a minute, and then kind of you guys turned it into something that you guys like, this worked, kind of using alternative thinking to be like, this is what we can do with this?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's probably happened to us a bunch of different times. The one that comes to mind most, we did a project with the Robert E. Lee House. Again, like, so like as a museum, or like when you work with museums, I mean, there's good history and there's sticky history.
Right.
And so the Robert E. Lee House, I mean, and in general, museum people, like, they're very like, just open-minded people. They do their very best to be objective, and they're like, Robert E. Lee was a general. This is a plantation. This is a place that held slaves. People were owned here and worked on this, on this property. But at the same time, we're in Virginia, and so like we want to be able to tell that story in a way that's true and honest, but also doesn't get us, doxxed by MAGAs. Like, we don't want people to show up with their guns and be like, how dare you tell that story. And we were doing something that was related to kids. So it was really challenging. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? So they flew me there. So I went to Virginia. So I'm on the plantation. Now, ironically, and this is another thing with history museums that's so interesting, Robert Lee left that mansion when he was, I believe, 3 years old. So he had almost no connection
Oh,
with
wow.
this mansion itself. They call it the Robert E. Lee Mansion, but it's like, like he, like his family like sold the mansion. Like, they didn't have a lot of money, they were in pretty dire straits. And so yeah, so it's actually, it doesn't really have a lot of Civil War history connection. So I was sort of like, okay, we don't need to tie this to Civil War at all. Like, this personality isn't actually tied here. And the house itself was an old house. Like, we're talking like 1700s, like late 1600s, which means very tight, dark walls and halls, right? That's what American architecture is like then. So they put me up on this, like, I'm there for like 2 days, and I've got 2 days to come up with something, right? That's both like honest, but also fun, because it is history and I want it to be palatable, and it's for kids, so it's like, I don't necessarily need to, we can be honest without necessarily needing to slap people in the face. And I was like, what do we have for resources that we can possibly use here? And I saw I'm in this little like cabin. They had this like sort of series of little artists' houses on the plantation. And so I'm staying there overnight, and like I'm there at like 2 a.m, and I'm like scribbling, and I'm like, oh, what am I gonna do with this? I've got nothing for these people. And they're all waiting the next morning. They're like, Kellian, come up with something brilliant. So I'm like, oh. And so I was trying to use whatever resources we have, right? So like whatever's sitting in front of you, like I say to my organizations all the time, I'm like, okay, you could try and make Fortnite, and you could try and spend the rest of your life trying to make Fortnite, and you'll never build anything. But if you take whatever you have on the table in front of you and just make that fun, nobody knows what you didn't build. Like, if a game falls in the forest and it's never created, does anybody hear it? No, nobody knows what you didn't build, and that's the thing, I'm sure you see this as well as a game designer, right? It's like, what's the difference between a novelist and a dreamer? One book. Right? Like, everybody talks about games, but it's rare for somebody actually to pull a game to the end and release it and let people play it. So yeah, so it's like, what do we even have for resources that we can use here? So what I came up with was squirrels.
Okay.
Squirrels. So this is an old house in the middle of a plantation, lots of land, lots of squirrels. Lots of squirrels. Like, let me tell you, there's like squirrels everywhere. They're like running rampant on this, like on this campus. And so, and then I did not realize this, but the Lee family, they actually had like a motto, and it was a squirrel. And after I started doing some more, they had like a shield. Their family shield was a squirrel. I think it was like Ne and Cautious Futuri or something like that. And then I did some sort of revolutionary era research on squirrels, and you find squirrels in a lot of different portraits from the 16th and 1700s, because they were supposed to symbolize preparing for the future. And so like squirrels, they gathered and they hid things, they prepared for the future. And so if you wanted to do a portrait of somebody to symbolize that this person was forward thinking and careful, then you would have like a squirrel somewhere like in a tree or around. And so I'm like doing all this research, and I'm just pulling up these Google Docs, and I was like, squirrel, squirrel, squirrel. It's like, oh, fantastic. So what we created was Squirrelly University. And we decided that when the Lee family sold their property at the time of Robert E. Lee's childhood, they worked with the squirrel community and set aside part of their land to create a squirrel university for forwarding the betterment of squirrels, because they had always had such a good relationship. And so the squirrels were there. So when you saw the squirrels scurrying around, then really they were going from class to class. You know, they were usually late for class. And in one of their classes, they really wanted to do research inside the house. But they're polite, and they know that squirrels aren't supposed to go inside the house. And that's why they need you. So the squirrels need you to help them do some research for their university project. And so we created this thing where we gave kids, like, it was like a little cushion. We gave them a book, and then they had to draw, and we had an app that went with it. So it was digital and physical. So you had a Squirrel Professor, and they would lead you into the house, and they would be like, thank you so much for being an intern and working on this project with us. We really needed your help. We can't do it ourselves. You know, we wouldn't go inside. We're not rats or anything. Yeah, and we used some really good like history education stuff too. You know, like, look in front of you. What do you see? You know, tell me 5 true things about this. Okay, now that you've learned 5 true things, tell me what you think this might be about. Like, try and solve this mystery with us. What do you think is the most expensive thing in this house? Like, one thing that I think is really interesting is in these 1600s houses, sometimes you'll find like metal cases, like really serious, like metal, what do you call it? Like safes.
Mhm.
And what did you keep in your safe? You would assume that you would keep silver in your safe. But actually what's as valuable as silver in the United States in, you know, the early 1700s is books. Because we didn't have printing presses, right? So you had to have, all of your books had to be shipped over. So books were wildly monetarily valuable. And so like in houses that were, you know, the sort of gentry houses, you would see these really solid cases, these bookcases that were like locked and loaded, you know, like with all these things on it. It's like, why are you guarding your books like that? So yeah, so we asked the kids questions like that. You know, why do you think in the 1700s somebody might need to guard a book? Why does that matter? Anyways, I digress. So Squirrely University, I think, is probably one of those situations where like we used an unusual resource. And what we ended up with was a super fun project. Their team loved it. I mean, they thought that I was drunk at first. When I proposed it, I was like, okay, so squirrels. And they were like, like, but they went for it.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, that gives a whole new definition to a secret bookcase.
Secret, doesn't it? Right? Like, they really actually, like, they weren't hiding something valuable in the bookcase. The books were the things that were of value. I just thought that was the coolest thing.
Yeah, and that's so fun because you know, I've never really thought about squirrels that way. Like, yes, they do, you know, they bury and they plan for the future, but you don't really connect that with, wow, these are really forward thinkers and humans also do this.
Well, they would do that for portraits. And I'm not quite sure how long they would do this. I don't think we do it now, but definitely from revolutionary portraits right up through, like Victorian portraits, you would sort of see things, and they did it earlier than that too. Like I've seen Renaissance portraits too, where they're like standing in front of a globe and they have their hand on the globe and they're like, standing in front of like pillars or something like that. And every object that they had in there was to represent something that person wanted to get across about their personality. And yeah, it's crazy how much you see squirrels show up. So you'll have to Google this. So afterwards, look up squirrel portraits. And the other thing that's really crazy and funny about this, I'm not quite sure, I'm going to do a little bit of research on this, but like the squirrels are really wonky looking. Like some of the squirrels don't look like squirrels at all. And that's because a lot of these painters were like these city dwellers and had never actually seen a squirrel. And so they were sort of doing these weird composite squirrels from descriptions that they heard in naturalist books, so they had like, it has like long ears and it has like, like short hand, like no animal you've ever seen.
That's so awesome. Just to, know that that's what someone came up with based on what they've heard about these mysterious things.
Yeah, exactly. The mysterious squirrel, like legend, animal of legend, squirrel.
That's so funny. And I love how it's like you took something that, nowadays people see them all the time, don't think twice about them.
So common.
Like, my dog pays attention to them, but
Absolutely.
This whole new world.
Well, it's so much more fun when you make something magic out of the mundane, because you can create this sort of, fascinating elf world, but you'll never touch it, whereas if you create magic out of like squirrels and portals in trees, then you in the back of your brain can imagine that maybe secretly are walking through a magical world. You're just not paying attention to it right now.
Yeah. Would you say that is kind of how you guys use an innovative design to keep everyone on their toes and to keep things fun, exciting for not only you guys and your team, but also for your clients and the people who are playing these games?
Yeah, the nice part about those kinds of stories is that if you give someone a prompt, like you just have to sort of knock it a little bit, like you don't have to tell the whole story, you just give a bit of a suggestion. And when you give people, Lizzie Stark, who's like one of my favorite human beings and like an excellent like researcher and writer of games and fiction that people create in their brains. She calls it, an alibi. There's an alibi for creation. If you give people an excuse to write stories in their brain, they do. So if you just say, oh, I recognize that squirrel. He was in class with me. And it's like, and if you look at your friend, and for like, depends on how good a friend it is, right? They might still have that sense of like, but if it's someone who's game, they'll be like, oh yeah, I saw them. They were in my English class too. Yeah. Oh my gosh, she was like really good at Shakespeare. I couldn't believe her accent was so fantastic. And so you don't have to fill in all the blanks, right? Like you just give an outline, and the fuzzier it is, the more it becomes clear in people's heads, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also something to say about how, you never want to be the one excluded. So if your friend is telling you about how that squirrel was in class, like your mind's like, okay, well, like, how can I be a part of this?
You better come up with something. Exactly. Think fast. But it's just sort of that yes and approach, it's just more fun when you give people stuff like that. And in general, people are totally game for it. I've been so shocked in my career how people have been game for all the crazy things I come up with. So many times I've been like in a museum, like I remember, like there's a couple moments in your life, but I remember specifically when I was like taping Space Invaders to the walls of the Peabody Essex Museum, and I was like, I can't believe they let me do this. I'm like in the Smithsonian literally with like black like markers writing messages, and I'm like, how am I getting away with this? Because people like to have fun, people like to tell stories.
Yeah. And I feel like that's maybe, like the at the end of the day, everyone likes to have fun. Everyone likes to tell a story
Exactly.
and be a part.
Everybody likes an adventure. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would love to hear a little bit about, what are you most excited for in terms of like future adventures?
Oh my gosh, future adventures. I've got a bunch of future adventures going out right now. It's a really interesting time right now, right? Because, at first when we sort of had this seismic shift, the first month was just everybody panicking, and now things are starting to coalesce. Like, what can we do? What can't we do? And so I'm thinking a lot about audio.
Hmm.
I've been really interested in audio and digital projection for the last year or so, just like what the capabilities are out there. And I love audio because it's so pervasive. And again, that idea of like drawing the box and letting people sort of fill in the center. So we do Club Drosselmeyer every year. Have you been? Have you been to Club Drosselmeyer
I
before?
have, I have.
Yay! Excellent, excellent. When did you go? Did you go this year?
I want to say that I went last year. I
Okay,
think that
cool.
my friends went this year. I think I was just like at something else, and I was like,
Oh yeah, no, I'm thrilled that you went. Thank you for going. Yeah, so it changes every year, or it has. And my initial idea was that I was going to do 4 years, right? So I was going to do 39 up until 42, and that was going to sort of take me through the Trump years, because there's so much crossover between what happened in that era, what's happening in our era, and so I really wanted to like echo things back and forth. And so every year I would do like extensive research on what happened that year, and then I would sort of parallel it with like, oh, what's happening now. There were so many things that were similar in a lot of ways, and so it was my intent this year to go back to 1939 again, but now that everything has changed, I'm really interested in doing maybe a live radio broadcast from Club Drosselmeyer. um
ooh.
yeah, so we're sort of playing with things, all these ideas of like what can be done with synchronous audio, right? So like everybody does asynchronous audio, right? Podcasts are such a common thing, but what if you could actually broadcast, right? Like what if you could broadcast in a radio? What if you could broadcast on multiple stations and people would have to turn physical radio stations in order to get different pieces of information? Where does everybody have a radio? In their car, right? So that's still social distancing, right? What if we broadcast something where people would listen to it and find different hidden locations and find different like characters and acts that they would have to like drive to, not necessarily, physically like interact with 150 people in a crowded nightclub, but it just had all these visions of what would happen if you like drive out to one of these historic estates and something's there.
That's so awesome.
I know, would it be so fun? And this
Yes,
idea of like everybody, right? Like everybody throwing their car doors open, and then, you crank up the radio. And of course, the one big thing that we have for Club Drosselmeyer is our music, right? We have, we rewrote the Nutcracker into Swingtime, and we own that score. Danny Fratina is an amazing musician. He teaches jazz in Istanbul now, but he still works with us. And Elise Roth runs our band, and so we're thinking probably this year we're going to, since everybody's in quarantine, we'll have all of our band record, so that we'll have like a full soundtrack, and that's what we can use as sort of like the base for our radio show as we move through it. So yeah, so it's all still very hand wavy right now, but like, the thing that I think like that I don't want to do right now, it's like, oh, I don't want to do like all the things I usually do, but worse. Right? It's like, oh wow, it's just like immersive theater, but worse, because you're sitting at home and it just sucks and you like interact with people. So it's like we've got to create something that was built for the resources that we have, like that same thing of like using the squirrels, right? Like we've got to use what we've been given. Yeah, and so that's why I'm thinking a lot about audio, audio, cars as the original, PPE, like You know, what can happen if you are mailed things, right? Like, what if we have like Christmas presents that you have to open at certain times, right?
I mean, you had to trust that people would open them at the certain times.
I know. Well, yeah, I don't think that it would make too much sense if they opened them early. They could cheat, but yeah. Yeah. I mean, everybody can always cheat, but I'm always shocked about that. I'm like, so wait a second, you're going to pay me to buy a ticket and then you're going to cheat on the ticket that you bought? Like, go for it. You know, like, if that's how you want to experience this. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. And we're building fast and furiously for, so the American Society for the Protection of Magical Creatures is creating their own website right now.
See?
Yes, because, you know, the board, they all got together and they decided that what with things the way they are now, that we need to have an online presence. Yeah, and so that was a Kickstarter project that I did. I'd intended for it to be just really small, grab a couple of friends, you know, build some puzzles out, and it ended up making like $16,000.
Wow.
I know, and I was like, oh, what do I do with this? So yeah, so I hired 15 people, and we currently have 4 games in production.
That's awesome. I mean,
yeah.
not going to ruin any of the games, so obviously I'm not going to be like, hey, tell me everything. But I'm excited.
Yeah, they're really coming along nicely. They're, you know, we've got some really just some great puzzle designers like Errol Elumir and Matthew Stein are 2 of our puzzle designers. We've got Annie Chung and Emily Robertson doing art. David Spira is helping us with design and like web UI. So like we've got some really, we've got musicians. We used some of the funds to get original music for different pieces in the game. So yeah, I think it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, this all sounds super exciting. Before I let you go, do you want to leave any little breadcrumbs of maybe like a hint towards what is coming our way?
Oh gosh. So the website, which is not up yet, but when it is up, it is going to be the ASPMC.org. So the American Society for the Protection of Magical Creatures. And we've seen like some really fascinating magical creatures coming through our doors. Actually, we're rediscovering them in the archives. Things like the crested lobguin, which is, you know, it's like a lobster, but it sort of waddles a little bit. There's the electric dunderfunk was one of the other things that was really interesting. It's sort of like an axolotl that like emanates electricity. So we've got just all sorts of wonderful creatures and puzzles and fun things coming out of there. So definitely check it out. It's coming up soon.
Yeah, I love everything about it. I can't wait to see some of your creatures in action and learn a little bit more about them, especially cute little waddly lobster looking things.
I know, can't go wrong with that, right?
No, I feel like it's gonna be like one of those things where like, well, are you gonna make those so I can have one?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny. Everybody's already asking for gear, and I'm like, I don't know how to make gear. Like stuffed lobguins. You know?
Awesome, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for chatting with us, and of course, thank you to the world for listening to us chat. And yeah, check out their soon-to-be magical creature website.